Let your body settle now. Feel the surface beneath you take your weight and notice how it holds you without effort, without conditions, without asking anything in return. The room is quiet. Whatever concerns followed you here can wait at the threshold. They have no authority in this space. You are here to rest, and that is enough. Breathe in slowly. Let the air move all the way down, past the shallow places where anxiety lives, down into the lower belly where the body knows how to be still. Hold it there for just a moment, and release. The breath goes out, and with it, the day goes too. You do not need to carry it anymore tonight. We're going to move together through a story. A long story, slow and dark and achingly human. About a mind so extraordinary that it could not find peace in a world that felt ordinary by comparison. About a man who was once a boy who looked at everything that existed and reached a conclusion that would define every day of his life after it. The conclusion was simple. The world was wrong. He was right. And the distance between those two facts was the wound that never healed. The name Lex Luthor has weight. You have felt it, even if you cannot quite say where the weight comes from. It carries something ancient in it, something that predates the comics and the films and the cultural machinery that turned him into an icon. It carries the specific gravity of a certain kind of intelligence, the kind that sees too clearly, too early, without the softening that ordinary experience provides. He was not born a villain. That word is too clean, too settled for what he became. He became something more complicated than a villain. He became a man who was absolutely certain he was right, in a world that kept demonstrating he was not, and who responded to that contradiction by deciding the world was the problem. Smallville, Kansas. The name does exactly what it promises. Smallville, a town of grain elevators and Friday football, and the kind of silence in the evening that feels like a held breath, like the land itself is waiting for something to arrive or to end. It is not a place that announces its significance. The fields roll out in every direction with the indifference of geography, and the sky above them is enormous in the way that Midwestern skies always are, making everything beneath them feel at once enormous in scale and microscopic in actual importance. This is where Lex Luthor began. Not in Metropolis, with its glass towers and its density of ambition, but here, in the specific middle of America, where the Luthor name was not yet a dynasty but a family, which is a very different thing. A family has warmth and damage in roughly equal measure. A dynasty has only the damage dressed in better clothes. The house where he grew up had a quality that certain houses have when money is present but love is not. Everything was maintained. The grounds were tended, the rooms were clean, the surfaces held no dust and no clutter. There were no piles of things left out, no comfortable disorder of the kind that accumulates when a house is lived in rather than managed. It was, in its way, a beautiful house. It was also a house where the air was always slightly too still, where conversations had edges that the participants were aware of even when they were speaking about nothing in particular, where the silences between sentences carried information that the sentences themselves were not permitted to carry. Into this house, Alexander Joseph Luthor was born. He was called Lex from the beginning, as though the fullness of the name was too much to sustain in ordinary conversation, though the truth was more specific than that. Lionel Luthor did not traffic in things that felt soft, and Alexander felt soft. Lex felt like a blade. It felt like something that could cut, and Lionel Luthor preferred the things around him to have that quality. He was a strange child, in the way that brilliant children are often strange. Not broken, not damaged in any visible way, but oriented differently than the children around him. Where other children in Smallville were absorbed in the ordinary textures of childhood, in the seasonal rituals of school and sport and social belonging, Lex was watching. He was always watching, with the particular quality of attention that would define him forever after, the attention of someone who is filing everything away, who is constructing from the available evidence a model of how the world actually operates beneath the surface of how it presents itself. What he concluded from that watching, by the age when most children are still figuring out the simpler rules of social existence, was that the world operated primarily on the basis of power, not principle, not fairness, not merit exactly, though merit could be instrumental to the acquisition of power if deployed correctly. Power was the operating system. Everything else was interface, and interfaces could be changed. He filed this conclusion away alongside everything else and continued watching. Sit with that for a moment. Let the image settle. A boy with red hair and an old man's eyes sitting in a room full of expensive quiet, watching the adults around him the way a taxonomist watches specimens. Not with cruelty, not yet. With something that in a different life might have become wisdom. The watching itself was not the wound. The wound was what he concluded from it, and the conclusions were shaped by who was doing the shaping. Because Lionel was there, Lionel Luthor, his father, who was the primary data point in the model Lex was building, the reference case against which all other human behaviour was being measured. And Lionel was, in the specific and irreducible way of people who impose their character on everything they touch, a man who believed that the world's fundamental nature was competition, and that the appropriate response to competition was to win. Not to participate, to win. The distinction mattered enormously to Lionel, who had built what he had built from very little, through methods he did not examine too closely, and who wore his success the way a predator wears its markings, as information, as warning, as advertisement of what would happen to those who did not take him seriously. The lessons Lionel taught Lex were not the lessons of the classroom, though Lex excelled in those without effort. They were the lessons of proximity, of watching how a man like his father moved through rooms, how he changed the quality of conversation simply by being present, how people arranged themselves differently in his vicinity, deferring and positioning and reading the subtle signals of his attention with the vigilance of people who understood that his approval had material value and his disapproval had material consequence. Lex learned these lessons the way a language is learned in immersion, not through explicit instruction, but through the accumulation of exposure, until the patterns became intuitive and the intuition became identity. There was love somewhere in the house. It existed the way that certain things exist in places where they are not fully welcome. Quietly, in the margins, in moments that were over almost before they had properly begun. Lex's mother was a presence that he understood more fully in retrospect than he was able to understand at the time, which is often how it is with the people who give us the softer things. They recede in memory into the background of the harder lessons, because the harder lessons are louder, and because the softer things require a kind of attention that urgency makes difficult. He was alone a great deal. This is perhaps the most important fact about his childhood, not the cruelty of his father, which was real and which shaped him, but the aloneness, which was something different. The cruelty he could orient himself against. The aloneness had nothing to push against. It was simply the condition of his interior life, a mind that moved faster than anyone around it could keep pace with, that arrived at conclusions before the conversation had properly started, that found in the company of peers something that looked like connection from the outside but felt from the inside, like the performance of a connection rather than the thing itself. He read everything. This is not a metaphor. He read everything available to him, which was considerable given the resources of the Luthor household, and he did so with the consuming systematic hunger of someone who understood, though he could not have articulated it this way at the time, that information was a form of power, that knowing more than the people around you altered the balance of the room in ways that did not require physical size or social ease, or any of the other currencies he did not possess in abundance. Books were a democracy of a particular kind. They gave the same information to every reader, and what differentiated one reader from another was not which books they read, but what they did with what they read, how they assembled the pieces, what model of the world they constructed from the available evidence. The model he constructed was extraordinary. By the time he left Smallville for Metropolis, it was already essentially complete in its architecture, though it would be expanded and refined and tested in the years that followed. It said, in its most fundamental terms, that human civilization was a machine that produced winners and losers through mechanisms that were neither natural nor inevitable but chosen, that the rules of the game were written by people who had already won it, and that the appropriate response to this fact was not resentment but mastery. Learn the rules, then write better ones, then enforce them. He was not wrong exactly. This is what makes him what he is, what makes the story of Lex Luthor something other than a simple, cautionary tale about the corruption of ambition. He was not wrong about the mechanisms of power. He was not wrong about the way that rules serve those who make them. He arrived at these conclusions through careful observation, and the observations were accurate. What was wrong? What was the wound that never healed? was what he did with those conclusions, what he built from them, what he allowed them to cost. There is a version of Lex Luthor that exists only in the imagination, only in the negative space of what he might have become. A mind of his caliber, directed toward the problems that actually beset the species: hunger, disease, the structural inefficiencies of systems that fail the people they were built to serve, would have been transformative. Not heroic in the way that word is usually deployed, not costumed or dramatic, but quietly, persistently, consequentially transformative, in the way that the best human minds have always been when they chose to apply themselves to the genuine suffering of others, rather than to the management of their own particular wound. The tragedy of Lex Luthor is not that he was evil, it is that he was capable of so much more than what he chose. The fields of Smallville stretched out beyond the town's edges in every direction, flat and amber and enormous, and in the evenings the light came down across them at an angle that made them look briefly like something sacred. He walked those fields sometimes, alone, in the specific solitude of someone who has chosen aloneness as the most honest available condition. The wind moved through the corn in a sound like breathing, like the land itself was alive and considering something, and he would stand at the edge of the field and look at the horizon where the amber met the darkening blue, and feel, briefly, the thing that comes before decisions, the open moment, the place where the future has not yet been written and anything is still possible. He did not know, standing there, what he would become. Nobody does, at that age, in those fields, with that sky. The self that is going to exist in 30 years is still only a direction, a lean toward one thing or another, a set of habits and conclusions that are still being assembled from the available materials. The assembly was already well underway, but it was not yet finished. And in the space between where he stood and where he would arrive, there were still choices to be made, still moments where the direction could have shifted, where the lean could have been corrected, where the boy in the field could have become something other than what the man eventually was. The boy who left Smallville was already the man who would become Lex Luthor. He was carrying everything he needed to become something magnificent, something genuinely good, something that the world had reason to celebrate. He was also carrying the specific damage that would ensure he never quite got there. Not because damage always wins, but because he never, in all the years that followed, fully chose to put it down. Let that settle as you breathe. The cool air moves in and the warm air goes out, and somewhere in the space between them is the question that Lex Luthor spent a lifetime refusing to answer. Not what the world owed him, but what he owed the world. Rest here in the quiet of that question. We will follow him forward when you are ready. There is no hurry. The story will wait. Let yourself settle a little deeper now. The weight of your body is fully supported. Feel that again, the surface beneath you doing all the holding so that you do not have to. Your breath is slower than it was when you arrived here, slower and wider and less urgent. There is nothing you need to solve tonight. There is only the story, moving forward at its own unhurried pace, and you moving with it. Every person who becomes what Lex Luthor became had a teacher. This is not an excuse. It was never an excuse, not for him, not for anyone. But it is a fact, and the facts are where the understanding lives. The teacher in Lex Luthor's case was present from the first morning and the last evening of his childhood. The teacher was his father, and what Lionel Luthor taught, through the patient and comprehensive curriculum of simply being Lionel Luthor in close proximity to a developing mind, was a complete philosophy of human existence. Thorough, internally consistent, and wrong in the specific ways that complete philosophies are always wrong when they are built entirely from one man's experience of one life. Lionel had come from nothing, or near enough to nothing that the distance collapsed in the telling. He'd grown up in Metropolis, in the suicide slums, which was a name that did exactly what names like that do. It told you the neighbourhood's relationship with hope. The buildings there absorbed the light rather than reflecting it. The streets ran with the particular variety of noise that belongs to places where people are living at the edge of what is bearable. Lionel had grown up knowing what it felt like to be small in a city that was indifferent to smallness, and what he had concluded from that knowledge was not that the city should be different, but that he should be bigger. The path he took to becoming bigger did not bear close examination, and Lionel did not examine it closely. He was not a man given to retrospective scrutiny of the methods by which he had arrived at his current position. He was a man who had learned, early and comprehensively, that the world distributed its rewards according to appetite, that the people who got the most were not necessarily the most deserving, or the most talented, or the most virtuous, but the most willing, the most persistent, the most comfortable with the fact that getting required taking, and that taking had consequences for the people from whom things were taken. He had made his peace with this arithmetic a long time ago, in a room in the suicide slums, with a clarity that people who have never been truly hungry find difficult to fully credit. By the time Lex was old enough to observe him, Lionel had become something. Not everything he intended to become, that was still in progress, but something substantial enough to have moved the family out of Metropolis and into a house in Smallville that announced its cost without advertising it, the way that certain kinds of money present themselves. He had Luthor Corp at that point still in its formative period, still being shaped by the combination of legitimate business acumen and less legitimate methods that Lionel deployed with equal facility and equal lack of guilt. He had connections in government and in finance, and in the particular grey spaces where government and finance meet each other quietly and exchange favours that do not appear in any official record. What he did not have, and what he perhaps did not know he was missing, was the capacity to be soft, not weakness. Lionel understood weakness very well, understood it with the precise and unsentimental knowledge of someone who had survived it in himself and learned to recognise and exploit it in others. Softness is different from weakness. Softness is the ability to let something in without immediately assessing its threat level, to receive rather than only to take, to be changed by another person rather than only to change them. Lionel's armour had been built to specifications that left no room for this. He had put it on in the suicide slums and he had never taken it off, and after enough time the armour and the man inside it had become the same thing. He loved Lex in the way that such men love their children, with expectation rather than acceptance, with investment rather than presence, with a specific quality of attention that is really a form of pressure, that says I see potential in you, and I am watching to see whether that potential becomes what I need it to become. This was not nothing. It was, in its way, a form of devotion, and Lex understood that it was devotion even as he understood that it was not quite the thing he needed. He understood this the way that children understand the difference between the food they are given and the food they actually want, not with anger, not initially, but with a quiet internal note, filed alongside everything else, about the gap between what was available and what was actually nourishing. The lessons were delivered through observation and through the less gentle method of Lionel's specific expectations. Lex was expected to be exceptional. This was not stated explicitly, because Lionel did not state things explicitly when they could be communicated more powerfully through implication. It was conveyed through the quality of Lionel's attention when Lex succeeded, a nod, a brief acknowledgement, the slight relaxation of something that had been held tight, and through the quality of his attention when Lex fell short of exceptional, which was something that happened because Lex was a child and children sometimes fall short of exceptional, and the quality of Lionel's attention in those moments was the most educational thing in the room. He did not shout. This is worth noting because the fathers in this kind of story are often imagined as shouting, as large and loud and physically threatening, and Lionel was none of those things in those moments. He was quiet. He was specific. He spoke in complete sentences that identified the failure with precision and placed it in the context of what would be required of Lex as he grew older and the world began to apply its actual expectations to him. The sentences were delivered without anger, which was in some ways more difficult to receive than anger would have been, because anger is hot and passes, while the calm precision of a disappointed father's assessment stays in the body for a very long time. Lex learned from this to be exceptional. He also learned something that Lionel perhaps did not intend to teach, which is that the self is primarily a performance, that what matters is not what you are but what you demonstrate, not the interior but the exterior, not the actual quality of your thinking and feeling but the legible product of that thinking and feeling as it appears to the audience that is always, always watching. He learned to manage his presentation with the thoroughness of someone who understands that the presentation is the primary data point available to others, and who has concluded that others cannot be trusted with the actual data. There were good days. It would be dishonest to the complexity of Lionel Luthor to pretend there were not. There were days when he took Lex somewhere, to a business meeting, to a site where something was being built, to a dinner in Metropolis where powerful people spoke to each other in the coded language of the powerful, and included him in the conversation in a way that made Lex feel, briefly and genuinely, that he was being prepared rather than evaluated. That the knowledge being transmitted was a gift rather than a test. On those days, Lex felt something close to what other children felt with their fathers, the particular warmth of being seen and valued by the person whose valuation matters most, and those days left their mark on him as deeply as the harder ones did. Because children take what they are given and make it mean what they need it to mean, and love the people who shaped them even when the shaping was not what it should have been. Even when the love that was available was conditional rather than unconditional, which is the only love that fully nourishes. Even when the lessons being taught were wrong in ways that would take decades to fully become visible. The attachment was real. The damage was real. Both of these things were true simultaneously, which is usually how it is. The specific thing that Lionel gave Lex, beyond the expectations and the quiet assessments and the occasional genuine warmth, was ambition as a framework for understanding existence. Not ambition as one quality among several, not ambition balanced against other values, but ambition as the primary lens through which all other things were to be understood. Success or failure, power or the lack of it. These were the coordinates by which Lionel navigated, and by the time Lex left his father's house, they were Lex's coordinates too. The inheritance was not the money, though there was money. The inheritance was the map. The map said that the world was a territory to be acquired. It said that other people were resources or obstacles, depending on their relationship to your current goals. It said that sentiment was a liability, and that clarity was a weapon, and that the person who understood the actual rules of any given situation would always hold the advantage over the person who was still operating under the rules that were advertised. It was a very good map for the world as Lionel had experienced it. It was a very incomplete map for the world as it actually was. Lex would spend his entire adult life navigating with this map, adjusting his routes when the territory refused to match, but never, or almost never, pausing long enough to consider that the map itself might need to be replaced rather than revised, that the problem was not the territory's failure to conform, but the map's failure to account for the full complexity of what the territory contained. The map had no legend for love that was not transactional. It had no symbol for trust that was not provisional. It had no scale for the weight of another person's interior life, which is the heaviest thing there is and which the map treated as essentially weightless. This was Lionel's gift to his son, extraordinary in its way, incomplete in the ways that matter most, and Lex carried it forward into every room he ever entered, spreading it out on the table and orienting himself by it, building his empire on its coordinates, making every major decision of his life using its guidelines, and arriving, by its logic, at exactly the destination it pointed toward, which was a place of tremendous power and specific, irreducible loneliness, from which the softer destinations could only be seen at a distance, like lights across a river that you have already chosen not to cross. Your breath is slow now. The story has moved through its first chapter and into its second, and the weight of it is settling into something that feels less like history and more like weather, like the specific atmosphere of a particular kind of life, pressing gently on everything within it. Let it settle. Let the image of Lionel Luthor and the education he provided drift slowly into the middle distance, the way all teachers eventually do, becoming less the immediate presence and more the permanent residue. We move forward now into the city where Lex Luthor arrived to become what he had always been prepared to become. The lessons that fathers teach their children through the medium of their own behaviour are the most thorough lessons that any education produces, because they are taught without the student's awareness that a lesson is being delivered, and they are absorbed at a depth that formal instruction never reaches. Lex did not sit in a classroom while Lionel explained his philosophy. He lived inside the philosophy, breathed its air, ate at its table, and understood it with the comprehension that comes from having no alternative framework available. A child cannot critique the water they swim in. They can only become someone shaped by it, and discover later, if they discover it at all, that other water was possible. Lionel's particular genius, if genius is the right word for it, was for making his version of the world feel like the world. Not a perspective, not an interpretation, but the actual structure of things as they are. He spoke about power and competition, and the necessity of winning not as values he had chosen but as facts he had discovered, the way one discovers that fire is hot or that water runs downhill. He had found the world operating according to these principles, and he had adapted to them, and his adaptation had been successful, and the success was the evidence. This is the most effective way to transmit a worldview, not to argue for it, but to demonstrate it, to let the results speak, to allow the child to watch and conclude for themselves that the approach that produced the results must be correct. There was a cruelty in this that was entirely unconscious, which made it no less a cruelty. Lionel was not trying to harm his son. He was trying to prepare him. The preparation and the harm were the same thing, which is a form of tragedy that does not require a villain, only a man who loved his son in the specific and limited way that his own life had prepared him to love, and who could not see the limits of that love because the limits were also the limits of everything he had ever learned to feel. Breathe in. Let the air move slowly, without urgency, filling the spaces that have been held tight all day, and breathe out. Again. The room is still. You are still. The story continues, moving forward through the years of a life, and you're moving with it, the pace of water finding its level. No rush, no effort, only the natural movement of things settling where they belong. Metropolis is a city that was designed to feel like a statement. This is not accidental. Cities of a certain kind are built not merely to house people, but to communicate something about the people who built them, about the civilization that produced them, about the relationship between human ambition and human scale. Metropolis communicates ambition without apology. Its towers reach with the specific vertical insistence of a place that has decided upward is the only direction worth going, and the light on their glass faces in the morning has the quality of something consecrated, something that was built to receive exactly this kind of light, and to reflect it back at the people below in a way that says, simply and powerfully, look at what we made. Lex Luthor arrived in Metropolis as a young man and understood it immediately, the way that certain people understand certain cities, not intellectually but somatically, in the body, in the sudden expansion of something that had been slightly compressed for the whole of his previous life. Smallville had been a holding pattern. Metropolis was the destination. He could feel the city's logic matching the logic he carried inside him, the organized ambition of it, the way everything within it was arranged in service of forward motion, of accumulation, of the conversion of intelligence and will and capital into more intelligence, and more will and more capital, compounding upward in the way that the towers compounded upward, each floor built on the solidity of the one below. He arrived with the Luthor name, which opened certain doors, and with the Luthor mind, which opened the rest. He enrolled at Metropolis University and moved through it with the efficiency of someone who understood that credentials were instrumental, that the degree was not the education, but the key to the room where the actual education happened, the room where the people who ran things met each other, assessed each other, and began the long process of deciding who among the new arrivals deserved to be admitted to the inner circles of genuine power. He performed well enough in the formal curriculum to satisfy its requirements, while devoting his primary attention to the informal one, which was the study of the city and the people who ran it. The city was full of them. The people who ran things or believed they did, or were in the process of acquiring the capacity to. Metropolis was a place where ambition concentrated, where the people who had decided that ordinary life was insufficient for them gathered and competed and made alliances and broke them, and accumulated resources and leveraged them, and sometimes failed spectacularly, in ways that the newspapers covered with the avidity they brought to all narratives about people falling from great heights. Lex watched all of this with the quality of attention he had been developing since childhood, the attention that filed everything away, that built models, that extracted the operating principles from the surface behavior and stored them for future application. What he was building, in those early years in Metropolis, was an understanding of the city's actual power structure, not the visible one, which was available to anyone who read the right publications and attended the right events, but the real one, the one that operated beneath the visible layer in the way that the foundations of buildings operate beneath the streets. The real power structure of a city like Metropolis is not the mayor's office, or the city council chamber, or even the boardrooms of the largest corporations. It is the relationships between those institutions and the people who navigate them simultaneously, who hold positions in several of the visible structures at once, and whose actual power derives from their position at the intersection rather than from any single institution. Pause here, if you will. Let the image of the young Lex Luthor moving through Metropolis settle for a moment. Young, focused, carrying everything Lionel taught him like a toolkit, applying it to this new territory with a systematic thoroughness that was already, even at this early stage, remarkable. The city spread out around him in all its glittering complexity, and he was reading it the way he had read everything, looking for the structure beneath the surface, finding it, and beginning to plan. This is not villainy yet. This is intelligence. This is a young man doing what the most capable young people do when they arrive in a great city with something to prove and the tools to prove it. The darkness is still ahead. Right now there is only the city and the young man and the plan. He took a position at LexCorp, at what was still at that point his father's company, in a division that was considered peripheral, which was where Lionel had placed him deliberately, testing whether his son would accept a lesser role gracefully, or would chafe against it in ways that would reveal the limits of his maturity. Lex did neither. He accepted the position without visible resentment, and spent the following 18 months transforming the division from peripheral to indispensable, which was a demonstration of competence so thorough and so quietly executed that it was over before anyone with the authority to obstruct it had understood what was happening. The division's revenues tripled. Its market position shifted from reactive to anticipatory. Lex had looked at what it was doing and understood that it was doing the wrong things well, when it could be doing the right things excellently, and he had made that adjustment with the efficiency of someone correcting a mathematical error. Lionel noticed. He was not a man who missed things happening within his own company, particularly things happening in the division where his son had been placed to be observed. He promoted Lex, not effusively but materially, giving him larger scope and watching what he did with it, and Lex did with it exactly what he had done with the smaller scope. He expanded the definition of the role beyond what had previously been considered its natural limits, and then he filled the expanded role so completely that the expansion became the new normal, and the new normal required Lex at its centre. This pattern, the acceptance of a constrained position, followed by the systematic expansion of its boundaries, followed by the consolidation of the expanded position into a new baseline, would repeat throughout Lex's career with the reliability of a law of physics. It was the most characteristic thing about his professional life, more characteristic even than the spectacular successes and failures that would define his public reputation in later years. The pattern expressed something fundamental about his relationship with limits. He did not rage against them, he did not loudly reject them, he simply and persistently rendered them irrelevant by operating in a way that made the limit a smaller and smaller proportion of his actual sphere. Metropolis during these years was changing, as great cities always are, under the pressure of forces that were partly visible and partly not, partly the result of choices made by the people who ran things, and partly the result of the accumulation of smaller choices made by the millions of people who lived in it, and whose collective weight shaped its character in ways that no single decision-maker could fully control. Lex was interested in both kinds of force, the deliberate and the emergent, the planned and the accidental, because understanding both was necessary for the kind of influence he was building toward. Influence at the level he envisioned required the ability to work with the city's emergent properties rather than only against them, to understand the currents well enough to steer within them rather than requiring still water. He began to make his own connections, independent of Lionel's, which was the move his father had simultaneously prepared him for and did not fully expect. The connections he made were carefully chosen, not the obvious ones, not the people who were already at the centre of the visible power structure, but the people who were positioned at the margins of multiple structures simultaneously, who moved between worlds, who had access without prominence. These people were more useful than the prominent ones, because prominence attracted attention, and attention attracted accountability, and accountability was a constraint. His preferred associates were effective rather than famous, capable rather than celebrated, and absolutely clear about what the relationship was and was not. The city rewarded him. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about Lex Luthor's relationship with Metropolis. The city gave him back, with compound interest, everything he invested in it. His wealth grew, his connections deepened, his understanding of the power structure expanded from a model to something approaching a complete map, updated continuously by the information that moved through his network, which was now substantial enough to provide coverage of most of what mattered. He was not yet what he would become, but he was becoming it, with the steady irreversibility of someone who has understood where they are going and has calibrated every choice in service of the destination. LexCorp became his in the fullness of time and through mechanisms that are best understood as a masterclass in the application of Lionel's own lessons, turned back against their teacher. The transfer of power between father and son was not a gift. It was an acquisition, achieved through the precise and patient deployment of every tool that Lionel had placed in Lex's hands during those years of education in Smallville. Lionel had taught him how power worked. Lex had applied the teaching, and if there was something poetic in this, the father's own curriculum providing the instrument of the father's displacement, Lex permitted himself to appreciate the poetry only briefly, the way he permitted himself to appreciate most things, quickly, completely, and then moving on. Metropolis at night from the top floors of the LexCorp Tower was a field of light. The city spread outward from the tower's base in every direction, its streets tracing patterns of illumination through the dark, its windows holding the warm evidence of lives being lived, of people moving through their evenings, eating and talking and resting, unaware of the view from above. Lex stood at those windows sometimes, in the early hours when the building was otherwise empty, and looked at all of it with an expression that the very few people who might have observed it would have found difficult to categorize. It was not satisfaction exactly. It was not happiness. It was something more specific, the look of someone who has acquired what they were after, and is finding that the acquisition has not answered the question it was supposed to answer. The city was his in every practical sense. Not through ownership, even Lex Luthor could not own Metropolis, but through the deeper possession of understanding. He knew how it worked. He knew who mattered and why and in what directions their influence ran. He knew where the leverage points were. He had built himself into the center of it, the place where all the threads converged, and the feeling of standing there was exactly as powerful as he had expected it to be. It was also, in ways he would not have predicted from the outside, quieter than he had expected. The view from the top is always both more and less than it appeared from below. He filed this observation away, alongside everything else, and continued building. The texture of Metropolis under Lex Luthor's growing influence was something felt more than seen. Cities absorb the character of the people who shape them, not in any single dramatic transformation, but in the slow accumulation of 1,000 small decisions that collectively redirect the flow of resources and attention and energy, in ways that only become visible when enough time has passed to observe the pattern they have made. The Metropolis that Lex was shaping was a city that rewarded a particular kind of intelligence, and a particular kind of ambition, that organized its opportunities in ways that were increasingly aligned with the logic he had brought to it from the fields of Smallville. He understood that cities are essentially arguments, ongoing, physical, three-dimensional arguments about what human beings are for and what they owe each other, and what kinds of lives are worth organizing around. Metropolis had been making a particular argument about these things for decades before Lex arrived, and the argument it had been making was not wrong exactly, but it was incomplete in ways that his presence would expand. He did not think of this as change imposed from the outside. He thought of it as the city becoming more fully what it had always been trying to be, more efficient, more capable, more organized around the actual distribution of talent and will, rather than the arbitrary distribution of birth and circumstance. Whether this was true, whether the city was actually improved by the particular direction his influence imposed on it, was a question that the people who lived in it answered differently depending on where in it they lived. From the towers, the view was of a more dynamic and more competitive and more technologically sophisticated city than the one that had existed before. From the streets that the towers threw into shadow, the view was sometimes different. The competitiveness had costs that landed with different weight at different altitudes, and the sophistication of the systems being built benefited some residents considerably more than others. Let your breath continue its slow work, in and out. The rhythm is natural now, not effortful, the body having found its pace without being told. Whatever was urgent an hour ago is smaller now, not gone, but smaller. The way things that feel enormous in the light of full attention become manageable in the soft distance of rest. You are here. The story is here. That is enough. LexCorp, at the height of its power under Lex Luthor's direction, was not merely a corporation. Corporations, in the conventional sense, produce goods, or services, or some combination of the two, and they compete with other corporations for market share in defined industries, and they grow or contract according to how well they navigate the conditions of those markets. LexCorp did all of these things, but it was also something that existed beyond those categories, a machine for the conversion of Lex Luthor's will into material reality, a mechanism by which one man's understanding of the world was translated into physical consequence. The divisions it contained spanned industries that had no obvious relationship to each other. Defense technology and agricultural chemicals and pharmaceutical research and media and real estate and emerging technologies in fields that were, in some cases, so new that the fields did not yet have established names. This diversification was not the unfocused accumulation of someone acquiring whatever was available. It was deliberate, architectural, the construction of a portfolio that provided coverage of enough of the critical systems of modern civilization that any policy or event or disruption that might affect one of those systems would, by design, affect LexCorp as an interested party, and LexCorp's interests were, by design, Lex Luthor's interests. He understood something that many of the most successful figures of his era understood, but few were willing to state directly, that the separation between the private sector and the public sector, between commercial interests and governmental authority, was a legal construct rather than an actual divide, and that the most consequential actors were always those who operated fluidly across the divide, who could move capital and influence and information through the gap between the two domains, and who understood the specific grammar of each well enough to be taken seriously in both. He built LexCorp to straddle that gap. Its defense contracts gave it access to governmental relationships that its media holdings could leverage in one direction, while its pharmaceutical research created policy dependencies in another. The employees of LexCorp experience their employer the way that people who work for very large organizations with very strong cultures tend to experience them, as an environment rather than a person, as a set of standards and expectations that seem to have emerged from the institution itself rather than from any individual will. Lex did not manage the organization directly, in the sense of attending to its daily operations. He managed it through the careful selection and deployment of people who understood his standards completely enough to apply them without constant supervision, who had internalized the logic of the enterprise deeply enough to make correct decisions independently. He was exceptionally good at identifying these people, which was perhaps his most important operational skill, the ability to recognize in a candidate the specific combination of intelligence and judgment and loyalty and ambition that would make them effective within his particular architecture of control. What he expected of the people who worked for him was not obedience exactly, though obedience was certainly required at the level of not acting against his interests. What he expected was comprehension, a thorough understanding of the situation, the goals, the constraints, and the priorities, sufficient to allow independent navigation without constant instruction. He respected people who understood things thoroughly. He had very little patience for people who needed to be told what to do with every new situation that arose. The people who lasted longest in his organization were the ones who could sit across from him and demonstrate, through the quality of their reasoning and the precision of their communication, that they had thought seriously about what he was trying to accomplish and had something genuinely useful to contribute to that project. He was difficult to work for, in the specific way that exceptional people are always difficult to work for. Not cruel, not arbitrary, not capricious, but demanding in a way that set the standard at a height that most people could not consistently reach. He noticed errors with a thoroughness that people found uncomfortable, not because he dramatized his disappointment, but because he simply expected that the error, having been noticed and discussed, would not recur, and this expectation had the quality of a physical pressure in the room when things went wrong. The people who thrived under him were the ones who shared his relationship to standards, who found the pressure of high expectations motivating rather than deflating, who experienced his attention, even when it was critical, as a form of investment. LexCorp's research divisions were where he spent the most personal attention. He understood that the company's long-term position would be determined not by the management of existing assets, but by the creation of new capabilities, and he directed the research program with the hands-on involvement of someone who was genuinely interested in what the scientists and engineers were working on, rather than merely invested in the commercial outcomes of their work. He read the technical reports himself. He attended the presentations of significant findings. He asked questions that demonstrated he had understood the material rather than just skimmed its implications. The researchers found this both gratifying and unnerving. The boss who actually understood what you were doing could appreciate your contributions in ways that a purely managerial boss could not, but he could also identify the weaknesses in your approach with equal clarity. The company's growth during his directorship was extraordinary by any measure. The revenue figures doubled, then doubled again, then expanded at a pace that made the earlier doubling seem modest. Its workforce expanded from thousands to tens of thousands. Its global footprint deepened from operations in Metropolis and a handful of other major markets to genuine presence in most of the significant economies of the world. It acquired companies with the strategic precision of someone collecting not companies but capabilities, not assets but options, not the things that existed but the things that could be made to exist with the right resources and direction. And yet, there was something in all of this that did not quite satisfy, and the not quite satisfaction was evident to the people closest to him, if to no one else. He had built something extraordinary. He was running it with a competence that was genuinely remarkable, that people who understood these things recognized as being in a category that few occupants of his position had ever approached. He had the money and the influence and the access and the power to act on a scale that put him in a small number of people who had ever lived. He had everything that his map had told him to want, and he had gotten it before the age that most people get around to wanting it seriously. The question that the map could not answer, because the map had never been built to address it, was the question of what it was for. Not LexCorp, not the Empire. Him. What was he for? The question arrived in the quiet moments, in the early hours at the window above the city, in the spaces between tasks when the next item on the agenda had not yet claimed all of his attention. It was not a question he had been prepared to encounter. Lionel's curriculum had been entirely about the how and the what, and not at all about the why, because Lionel's answer to the why was so obvious to him that it had never required articulation. The why was the getting. The why was the having. The why was the position at the center of things, looking out at everything that existed within your sphere of influence. But looking out from the center, Lex was finding, was different from looking up at the center. From below, the center had seemed like a destination. From within it, it revealed itself to be a location, just a place where you were, like any other place, with its own specific qualities and its own specific limitations, and with the additional characteristic that the journey to it had been so consuming that the arrival left a silence where the journey had been, and the silence was louder than anything he had been prepared for. LexCorp continued to grow. He continued to run it with the same standard of excellence that had always characterized his direction. The external evidence of his life during this period was a picture of unambiguous triumph. The profiles in the business publications, the awards from the industry bodies, the invitations to the rooms where the most consequential conversations happened, all accumulated with the steady rhythm of a life proceeding according to plan. Internally, quietly, something was shifting, not breaking, not failing, shifting in the way that tectonic things shift, slowly, with enormous pressure, in a direction that would eventually produce consequences that were not yet visible on the surface. He needed something to push against. This is the truth that the Empire, for all its size and complexity, could not provide. He was exceptional at building things, at running things, at optimizing the systems within his control for maximum effectiveness. But the systems within his control were, by definition, within his control, which meant that their relationship to him was fundamentally one of compliance rather than resistance. Compliance is useful. Resistance is necessary. Without something that pushed back with genuine force, without something that could not be brought within his sphere of influence by the standard application of intelligence and will and capital, the Empire was an exercise in elaborating a territory he had already conquered. He did not know, in those early years of the Empire, that what was coming would be so much larger than anything he had imagined. He did not know that the sky was about to open and offer him the resistance he had been waiting for, in a form so unexpected and so absolute that it would reorient everything. His ambitions, his resources, his definition of the problem, his understanding of his own place in the world. He did not know that a man was coming who could not be acquired or neutralized or brought within any sphere of influence that money could build. All of that was still ahead, for now the Empire extended to every horizon, and Lex Luthor stood at its center, and the silence was very quiet, and the city lights reached all the way to the edge of the dark. The cost of building an empire is almost never denominated in the currency that the empire itself produces. LexCorp generated money and influence and access and power, all of which were the stated objectives of the enterprise, and all of which Lex accumulated with the systematic thoroughness that characterized everything he built. The cost was paid in a different currency entirely, in the relationships that were never formed, the experiences that were never had, the version of his life that running the empire continuously displaced, without his ever quite noticing that the displacement was happening. He worked in the way that a certain kind of highly organized person works when they have no natural stopping point, not from compulsion, not with the frantic quality of someone who cannot stop, but with the steady committed attention of someone who finds in the work something closer to comfort than to duty. The work was where his extraordinary mind was fully engaged, where the gap between what he was capable of and what he was actually doing was at its narrowest, where the specific discomfort of being Lex Luthor was most effectively managed by the simple fact of there being no available attention for it. This is one of the less frequently acknowledged functions of exceptional work, not only what it builds, but what it displaces. People who encountered him in professional contexts during this period found him unlike anyone they had previously worked with, which was partly the unusualness of his intelligence, and partly something harder to name. A quality of being fully there, of bringing the complete attention of a remarkable mind to whatever was in front of it, that was both flattering and slightly unsettling. He listened with an attention that people were not accustomed to receiving, that made them feel both valued and exposed, as though the listening were also a form of analysis, which it was. The silence between tasks was the part he managed most carefully. Not the silence itself, which was simply the absence of noise, but what the silence contained, the particular quality of his own interiority when there was nothing occupying it, which was something he had learned early to keep filled, though he would not have described it this way, and which the Empire provided in abundance, which was perhaps among the things the Empire was most useful for. You are deeper now than you were at the beginning. The breath is very slow. The mind has let the day go, or most of it, and what remains is the soft territory between waking and sleep, where stories move through us differently, not as information to be processed, but as weather to be experienced, felt, rather than analysed. Let the next segment of this story arrive in that way. Just let it come. It happened in the daytime, in full view of the city, which was the part that nobody had a framework for. Catastrophes in the human imagination tend to come at night, in the dark, in the spaces where the visible world has already retreated and the conditions for strange things are established. This one came in the broad light of a Metropolis afternoon, and the sky above the city did not hide what was happening, but displayed it with a terrible clarity, every detail sharp and present and impossible to dismiss as dream or misperception. A man fell from the sky. That is the simple version. The fuller version is that a man arrived in the sky above Metropolis during a moment of crisis, a crisis generated by other forces, other actors, a collision of threats and circumstances that had nothing to do with Lex Luthor. And he resolved it. He resolved it with a combination of capability and composure that were both individually extraordinary, and together constituted something for which no existing category was adequate. He caught things that could not be caught. He stopped things that could not be stopped. He moved through the constraints of physics, gravity, momentum, the fixed velocity of objects in free fall, with the easy authority of someone for whom those constraints were advisory rather than mandatory. And then he was gone, back into the sky, which closed behind him the way the surface of water closes after something has entered it, completely, leaving no trace of the passage as though it had never happened. The city he left behind was whole, which was the point, which was the thing he had accomplished. The people in it were safe, which was the thing they felt, standing in the streets looking up at the ordinary blue where the extraordinary thing had just been, feeling the specific quality of relief that belongs to people who have been told, by the evidence of their own senses, that there is something in the world that is very large and is not threatening them. sit with what that moment meant for Lex Luthor. Not for the city. For him specifically, standing at the window of the LexCorp Tower, watching the scene unfold with an attention that was different from everyone else's attention in the city below. The city was watching in awe, or gratitude, or fear, or some combination of all three that would take weeks to fully process and years to begin to understand. Lex was watching with none of those things. He was watching with the focused, systematic attention of someone who has just encountered something new in a world they thought they had fully catalogued, and who is beginning, in real time, to revise the catalogue. What he felt was not the awe that the city felt. It was not gratitude. Fear was present, but not the fear of the people in the street, not the fear of someone who has nearly been harmed and has been saved. It was a more specific and more interior fear, the fear of someone who has built their identity on a particular understanding of the world and who has just been shown evidence that the understanding is incomplete. Not wrong, necessarily, not entirely, but incomplete in a way that had material consequences for every position and plan and strategy that the incomplete understanding had produced. The man in the sky was not in the catalogue. This was the first fact. He was not on any list of known capabilities, any intelligence file, any competitive analysis of the power landscape of Metropolis or the world. He had appeared without precedent, from outside any framework that Lex had constructed, and he had demonstrated capabilities that placed him outside the category of what Lex had previously understood to be the ceiling of human potential. He was not human, presumably. The things he had done were not things that human physiology produced. He was something else, from somewhere else, and his presence in the city was a fact that now had to be incorporated into the model. The incorporation process began immediately. This was Lex's most reliable quality, the speed with which he processed new information and began reworking the models that the new information affected. He did not stand at the window feeling for very long. He stood at the window thinking, which for him was a much more natural use of the same period. He was thinking about what he had seen. He was thinking about its implications. He was thinking about what it meant for every calculation he had made about the distribution of power in the world, and about what adjustments were required to those calculations, and about what the adjustments implied for the strategies that the original calculations had produced. The first adjustment was the most significant. Lex Luthor had constructed his life and his empire on the premise that power was ultimately a human phenomenon, that it was generated by human intelligence applied to human systems, that its ceiling was defined by what human minds and human institutions could accomplish, and that the person who best understood those human systems and most effectively deployed their own human intelligence within them would occupy the highest available position. This premise had produced everything he had. It had been, as premises go, remarkably productive. It was also, he now understood, insufficient, because there was now something in Metropolis that was not governed by the premise, that operated outside it entirely. The man in the sky, whom the newspapers would shortly begin calling Superman, a name that Lex turned over in his mind with the specific discomfort of someone encountering a word that gets something importantly right, while also getting something importantly wrong, was not subject to the dynamics that Lex had spent his life understanding and exploiting. He could not be financially pressured, because he had no financial needs. He could not be politically leveraged, because he occupied no position within any political structure. He could not be outmaneuvered through the control of information or resources or relationships, because he did not depend on any of those things for the exercise of his capabilities. He simply existed, with those capabilities, in the city that Lex had spent years making his own. And people loved him. This, in some ways, was the most disorienting fact of all. The city's relationship with Lex Luthor was one of respect, of reliance, of the specific regard that a powerful and effective patron commands from the community that benefits from its presence. It was not love. Love is different. Love is the thing that people give to those who make them feel safe without requiring anything in return, who demonstrate through action rather than argument that they are entirely on the side of the people they serve, whose motivation is transparently and completely the welfare of others, rather than any form of personal gain. Lex had never produced that quality in anyone, and he had not particularly wished to because the map he navigated by had no use for it. Superman produced it immediately, effortlessly, without apparent awareness that he was doing so. The city gave him its love the way that cities give their love to the things that save them, completely, without conditions, without requiring anything beyond the saving itself. And Lex watched this from his window with the expression of someone observing a phenomenon that their model said could not exist, and finding that the model needs revision rather than that the phenomenon needs to stop. He began to research. This was his first response to almost every significant challenge. Systematic information gathering, thorough and patient, building from whatever was available toward a comprehensive understanding of the new variable and its properties. He set resources to the project, quietly and without announcement, directing people he trusted to collect everything that existed about the newcomer, the event reports, the eyewitness accounts, the fragmentary physical evidence, the patterns of appearance and behavior and capability. The picture that assembled from these pieces was incomplete, as pictures assembled from public sources always are, but it was enough to begin working with. What he was working toward in those early weeks and months of research was an answer to a question that had not previously existed in his world. How do you understand something that has no precedent? Not a new competitor, not an unfamiliar technology, not a shift in the regulatory environment or the capital markets or the geopolitical landscape, all of which he had experience navigating. Something genuinely new, something that required entirely new tools because the existing toolkit had never been designed for it. The answer he arrived at slowly and through a process that was less systematic than his usual methods, because the usual methods had nothing to grip, was that you studied it the way you studied anything you needed to understand and eventually to counter. You found its properties, you determined its limits, you identified what it could not do as precisely as you identified what it could. Every capability had a boundary, every strength had a complement. The man in the sky was extraordinary, but extraordinary was not the same as infinite, and Lex Luthor had built everything he had by finding the boundaries of things that appeared to have none. The obsession, as it would eventually be called by people who observed it from the outside without the full context of what he was actually engaged in, had its origin here, not in hatred, which came later, but in the recognition of a problem that demanded to be solved. Superman was a problem. Not because he was evil, he was not evil, and Lex was clear-eyed enough to see this even in those early days, which were also the days when clear-eyed assessment was still possible. He was a problem because his existence changed everything, and Lex Luthor's entire life had been built on a particular understanding of everything, and that understanding was now, permanently and irrevocably, inadequate. The sky had opened. What came through it had made the world a different world, and Lex Luthor, alone at his window above the city, had already begun the work of figuring out what that meant. Metropolis had not been designed for what Superman represented, and neither had any other city, because no city had ever needed to be. The civic infrastructure, the legal frameworks, the emergency response systems, the media protocols for significant public events, the insurance classifications for property damage, none of it had been built with the assumption that an individual capable of the things Superman was capable of might exist and operate within the city limits. The systems adapted, as systems always adapt to conditions they were not designed for, with the particular combination of improvisation and permanent revision that marks a real accommodation rather than a temporary patch. Lex watched this adaptation process with the attention of someone who understood that how a system responds to an unprecedented variable reveals the system's actual architecture more clearly than normal operating conditions ever do. What the city's response revealed was that Metropolis, despite its sophistication and its resources, had no framework for what Superman was, no category, no institutional memory, no precedent to draw on. The newspapers called him a hero, which was a category that existed and that fit some of the surface features of what he was doing, but that was also, Lex recognized, entirely inadequate to the actual complexity of the situation. Heroes were human. Heroes operated within the limits of human capability and human accountability. Superman was something that the word hero had not been invented to describe. The question of what he felt seeing Superman for the first time was one he returned to rarely and briefly in the years that followed, the way that people return to the most significant moments of their lives, not to relive them, because they cannot be relived, but to check whether they still mean what they originally meant, whether the meaning has shifted with the passage of time, and the accumulation of subsequent events. The meaning had not shifted. If anything, it had deepened, the way that significant things deepen when you have enough subsequent experience to understand what they were initiating. Rest here for a moment before we continue. Your body knows how to do this. Let it. The breath arrives without being summoned and departs without being released. Somewhere in the body, the places that hold tension are choosing one by one to let it go. The story waits, patient as all old stories are, for you to be ready for the next part. The research program that Lex assembled in the months following Superman's first appearance in Metropolis was, in miniature, a version of the same systematic intelligence operation he had applied to every significant problem of his professional life. Teams working independently, reporting to separate intermediaries, each holding only a portion of the total picture so that the picture itself lived only in his head. It was meticulous, expensive, and apparently without clear commercial justification, which meant it was the kind of project that could only exist under someone with complete control of their organization and complete freedom from the need to explain their resource allocation to outside stakeholders. What the research returned, over the following months, was a portrait assembled from the edges of things. Superman's origins remained opaque. Whatever he was and wherever he came from had not left sufficient trace in any accessible record for the researchers to definitively establish. His capabilities could be mapped through the event reports with reasonable precision. The strength, the speed, the flight, the resistance to physical damage, the vision that extended through solid objects and across distances that should have been beyond perception. These were documented. They were real. They were extraordinary in their scope and their consistency. What was not in the research at first was any evidence of a limit. This was the most significant finding of the early phase, not because it proved there was no limit. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, as Lex was well aware, but because it established the baseline difficulty of the problem. He was working with a subject that had not yet been observed to fail at anything it had attempted. The boundary, if there was one, had not yet been reached by any event or force that had presented itself naturally, which meant that the identification of the boundary, if the boundary existed, would require something more deliberate than the passive collection of incident reports. The green meteorite came through a procurement channel that Lex had established for exactly this kind of acquisition. Rare and unusual materials, particularly those associated with anomalous events or with phenomena that the mainstream scientific community had not fully characterized. It arrived labeled with the scientific notation of its chemical composition and the geographic coordinates where it had been found, embedded in the earth of a rural Kansas county that Lex noted, without particular surprise, was in the same general region as Smallville. The universe, as he had observed on several previous occasions, had an aesthetic preference for symmetry. The material's initial analysis was conducted by a small team of physicists and material scientists whose security clearances Lex had verified personally. The results came back over several days, each report expanding the previous one's account of how unusual this material was. It emitted radiation in a spectrum that had no natural terrestrial analogue. Its crystalline structure contained elements in configurations that did not occur in any known mineral. Its radioactive properties were stable rather than decaying, which should have been impossible, which meant that whatever nuclear processes were responsible for them operated according to rules that the existing physics of radioactive decay did not fully describe. Lex read these reports with the focused attention he brought to everything that interested him genuinely, which was different from the focused attention he brought to things he considered merely important. The material interested him in the deeper sense. There was something in its properties, the specific character of its radiation, the way it existed outside normal physical categories, that suggested it was not merely unusual but fundamentally different in origin, which was consistent with what he was already hypothesizing about Superman's origins. The two things were related. He was increasingly certain of this, with the particular certainty that comes not from proof, but from the alignment of multiple independent lines of evidence pointing in the same direction. The test was simple in design. It required the construction of a containment and delivery system for the material's radiation, and a proximity experiment and observation of results. Lex designed the technical parameters of the test himself, working through the engineering requirements with the same hands-on engagement he brought to the research divisions of LexCorp. not because the engineering was beyond the people he employed, but because this was not something he was willing to delegate. The test was designed, built, and conducted within a time frame that would later surprise the people who learned of it, though the speed was consistent with the standard he applied to everything he was genuinely motivated to accomplish. Superman weakened in its presence. That was the finding. The specific, extraordinary, unprecedented finding that Lex Luthor had spent months of careful work positioning himself to discover. In proximity to the material's radiation, the capabilities that the man in the sky had demonstrated so effortlessly in Metropolis began to fail. The strength diminished. The resistance to physical damage reduced. The composure that had been so absolute and so unsettling in its totality showed its first evidence of strain. He was not impervious. He was not invulnerable. He was a living system that could be affected by the right environmental conditions, and Lex Luthor had found those conditions. The feeling that accompanied this discovery was complex, and Lex permitted himself a longer time in it than he usually permitted for any single reaction to any single development. There was the satisfaction of a problem that had resisted solution yielding to patient and systematic effort. This was a feeling he knew well, one that had accompanied many of the significant achievements of his career, and it was as clean and as reliable as it had always been. There was also something else, something he did not have a precise name for, something he would not have described as joy, but that had some of joy's quality. The specific lift that comes when the world demonstrates that it is more navigable than it appeared, that the things which seemed absolute are merely conditional, that the ceiling is, as it always has been, a question of finding the right approach. He named the material kryptonite. The name came quickly, the way names for significant things sometimes do, not the product of deliberation but of recognition, as though the name had been waiting for the thing to be discovered. Krypton was the linguistic ghost of an origin that the material now confirmed. The suffix transformed the origin into a substance, a material thing, something that could be held and used and refined and deployed. Kryptonite, a word that would, in time, acquire a meaning in the cultural vocabulary that extended far beyond the green crystal that Lex Luthor had locked in a containment chamber in a sub-level of LexCorp's research facility. What he had, now, was leverage. Not in the sense of a threat to be immediately deployed. Lex was not, at this stage in the evolution of his relationship with Superman, operating from a position of enmity. He was operating from the position he always occupied when he acquired significant capability, the position of strategic option. The kryptonite was an option. Options were never wasted by premature exercise. They were held, carefully and patiently, for the moment when their deployment would produce the maximum effect and the minimum cost. He was very good at holding options. The discovery also changed something in the nature of his thinking about Superman, in a way that was significant though difficult to articulate precisely. Before the kryptonite, Superman had been a phenomenon, something to be studied and understood, a variable in the model that needed to be characterized before it could be properly accounted for. After the kryptonite, Superman became something different. He became an adversary, not an enemy, not yet. The distinction between adversary and enemy was one that Lex maintained carefully, because enemies were personal and adversaries were strategic, and he had not yet allowed the situation to become personal. But an adversary, certainly. Someone whose capabilities now had known limits, whose position in the world was now subject to the same kind of strategic analysis that Lex applied to all the other significant actors in the landscape he navigated. The containment chamber held the kryptonite with the care appropriate to something both precious and dangerous. Lex visited it sometimes, in the way that people visit things they have worked very hard to acquire, not to do anything with it on those visits, but simply to verify that it was there, that the achievement was real and persistent, that the discovery had not been a temporary aberration that the universe intended to revoke. It glowed faintly in its containment, the green light pulsing with the slow regularity of something alive, something breathing in its strange alien way, something that had travelled an unimaginable distance to end up in a sub-level of a Metropolis skyscraper under the careful stewardship of the most interesting human mind on the planet. He did not know, standing in that room, what he would eventually do with what he had found. The future was still open, still various, still full of alternatives that had not yet collapsed into the single timeline that actually occurred. There were versions of Lex Luthor accessible from that moment who would use the kryptonite differently, not as a weapon but as a guarantee, a deterrent, the thing that ensured that the extraordinary force newly present in Metropolis remained accountable to something, remained subject to some constraint that the human world could understand and invoke. There were versions who might have gone to Superman directly, shown him what had been found, and offered it as the foundation of something more collaborative than adversarial. Those versions of Lex Luthor were real, in the sense that the moment was real and the alternatives were open. What closed them, one by one, was not a single decision, but an accumulation of smaller choices, each individually understandable, each made with the map that Lionel had given him and that he had never fully revised. The map said that power sought power. The map said that a leverage point once identified was for use. The map said that the only safe position relative to something larger than yourself was the one that ensured its behaviour remained aligned with your interests. The map was always there, and he always trusted it, and the alternatives that required a different map stayed alternatives, unrealised, while the path the map pointed toward narrowed with each step he took along it. The science of kryptonite would occupy a significant portion of LexCorp's most classified research capacity for years after the initial discovery, not because the initial findings were insufficient. They were quite sufficient for the purpose of establishing that the material was the answer to the question Lex had been asking, but because sufficiency was never a reason to stop if thoroughness was available. He wanted to understand not just what it did, but how it did it, what the mechanism of its effect on Superman's physiology actually was, what the relationship between its specific radiation profile and the extraterrestrial biology it affected could tell him about both the biology and the material. The answers that the research produced were partial in the way that answers to genuinely unprecedented questions are always partial. They established enough to be useful while opening new questions faster than they closed old ones. What emerged, over the years, was a detailed picture of a substance that was simultaneously natural and impossible, that obeyed physical laws but not quite the physical laws that terrestrial science had established, that interacted with Superman's biology in ways that suggested his biology was governed by principles that earthly medicine had never needed to account for. The science was extraordinary, and the fact that its primary application was the harm of a specific individual who had never actually harmed anyone was something that Lex's scientific mind was better equipped to contain than his moral one. What Lex permitted himself to feel about the kryptonite in the private language of his own interior was something close to relief. Not satisfaction. Satisfaction implied a completion, and this was a beginning. But relief, the specific easing of a tension that has been sustained without acknowledgement for long enough that its release produces a physical effect, a loosening in the body that the person experiencing it had not known was there until it let go. Notice how the breath has found its own pace now. It does not need direction. The body knows this rhythm, knows it from the inside, and does not need to be told. You can simply rest here, in the slow inhale and the quieter exhale, while the story continues its unhurried movement through the years of a remarkable and troubled life. The presidency, when it came, was the logical extension of everything that had preceded it. This is what people who examine Lex Luthor's political career from the outside tended to miss. The fact that it was not a departure from his commercial and strategic activities, but their continuation by other means. The presidency was not a different kind of ambition than the empire. It was the same ambition, operating in the domain where the most consequential levers of actual power were located. He had spent decades learning where the real power in American society resided, and what he had learned was that the most powerful individual position in any democratic system is not the CEO of the largest corporation but the executive authority of the state, which controls the apparatus of law and legitimacy and organized force that corporations can influence but can never replace. He ran as himself, which was either a mark of extraordinary confidence or extraordinary calculation, or both simultaneously, which is probably the most accurate characterization. The Lex Luthor who presented himself to the electorate was recognizably the man that the public had come to know through decades of LexCorp's presence in their lives. Brilliant, direct, willing to address the complexity of problems with something approaching actual complexity, rather than reducing everything to the reassuring simplicity that political communication usually demanded. He did not pretend to be more ordinary than he was. He offered his extraordinariness as the point. The public responded in ways that confounded the conventional wisdom of the political consultants, who studied his campaign with the baffled attention of people encountering a phenomenon that their models said should not succeed, and that was succeeding anyway. He did not have the warmth that the consultants' models required. He did not perform the specific kind of everyman accessibility that polling consistently indicated was essential to electoral success. He offered intelligence and competence, and the frank admission that the problems facing the country were difficult in ways that required more than slogans, and enough people found this sufficient, found it, in fact, more compelling than the alternatives, that he won. Pause here, for just a moment. Lex Luthor, President of the United States. Let the weight of that settle. Consider what it means that a man with his history, his methods, his ruthlessness, his specific relationship with the truth, could arrive at the highest office of the most powerful nation on earth through the legitimate mechanisms of democratic choice. This is not a story about a coup or a theft or a subversion of democratic process. The people chose him. And the question of what that says about the people, about the country, about the conditions that make a Lex Luthor electable, is a question that does not have a comfortable answer, and that the story does not try to provide one for. The White House received him the way that old institutions receive new occupants, with the patient institutional knowledge of a place that has housed many people and outlasted all of them, that knows the furniture will eventually be rearranged and the priorities will change and the face at the center of things will be replaced in due course by another face, and that in the meantime will provide the infrastructure of power and wait for the occupant to reveal themselves through the choices they make within it. Lex made choices quickly, which was his habit. He reorganized the policy apparatus with the same instinct for structural efficiency that had characterized his management of LexCorp, identifying the processes that were producing friction without value and modifying them. Some of what he did as president was genuinely good. This requires acknowledgement because the story of Lex Luthor is easy to read as a continuous descent and harder to read accurately, which is as a more complicated trajectory containing real achievements alongside the corruption that eventually overwhelmed them. He directed significant federal resources towards scientific research that had been underfunded for years. He reformed procurement processes that had been generating enormous waste. He approached several foreign policy challenges with a strategic clarity that his predecessors had struggled to bring to them. The people who worked for him directly, who were in a position to observe the quality of his engagement with the actual problems of governance, described him with a mixture of admiration and discomfort that captures the genuine complexity of what he was. The discomfort was the other thing, the thing that ran beneath the accomplishments like a current beneath still water. He used the power of the office the way he had always used power, as a tool to be applied toward his objectives, with a thoroughness that did not stop at the lines that convention had established. Not always illegally. Lex was too precise in his understanding of legal exposure for careless illegality. But the spirit of the constraints, the norms that gave the legal rules their meaning and their function in a system that depended on more than mere legal compliance, those he treated with the same instrumental logic he applied to everything else. Useful when their utility was demonstrated, inconvenient when it was not. His relationship with Superman during this period acquired new dimensions that it had not previously had. As president, Lex occupied a position that gave his relationship with Superman formal institutional character. The executive authority of the United States had both the responsibility and the claimed right to address the question of an extraterrestrial presence operating within American territory and airspace, which was a question that Superman's existence raised and that no prior administration had been required to answer seriously. Lex had views on this question. He had been developing those views for years through the research on the kryptonite and the careful observation of Superman's activities and their implications. Those views had not softened with time. They had, if anything, calcified, become more structural, more ideological, less the product of ongoing genuine inquiry, and more the expression of a position that had been settled and now required only justification. He believed, with a conviction that had crossed the line from reasoned conclusion to article of faith, that Superman's presence was dangerous regardless of his intentions, that the concentration of so much capability in a single individual, without accountability to any human institution, without constraint by any force that human civilization could apply, represented a threat to the very concept of human self-determination that was independent of whether that capability was currently being used benevolently. The benevolence was the wrong variable. The variable that mattered was the capability and its absence of institutional check. He made this argument to his cabinet and to the relevant intelligence and security personnel, and to the small number of other world leaders who were thinking seriously about the same question. He made it with the precision and the force of his best rhetorical work, and the argument was not without merit. The questions he was raising about accountability and institutional oversight of extraordinary capability were real questions, questions that a society committed to democratic governance had legitimate reason to ask. The problem was not the questions. The problem was that the questions were being asked by someone whose concern for them was less than fully separable from his personal history with the man they concerned, and that this made the stated rationale and the actual motivation difficult to fully disentangle, even for the person doing the asking. The presidency ended as it was always going to end, not with a clean transition, but with the kind of collapse that happens when the thing being sustained by extraordinary effort and strategic management finally encounters more weight than management can bear. The specific form the collapse took was his own doing, a scheme too elaborate, a risk miscalculated, a moment when the instrumental logic that had produced so much was applied to something that the logic was not equipped to handle. The details are less important than the shape of it, which was entirely consistent with the shape of every previous failure in his career, a point at which the map and the territory diverged so badly that navigation became impossible, and the navigator, unable to trust any chart but the one he had always used, drove confidently into the ground. He left the White House in circumstances that stripped away the title and the office and the formal power, and left him in the condition that most truly characterized him, a private man of extraordinary capability and no current institutional base, which had been his starting condition and which, he understood with the clarity of someone who had been here before, was also the condition from which he had always been most dangerous. The institutions gave him scale, their absence gave him freedom, and what Lex Luthor did with freedom across the entire arc of his adult life was build. The country he left behind had been changed by his passage through its highest office, as it is always changed by whoever occupies that office, not transformed, not redirected in any permanent way, but marked, the way that all significant passages mark the things they pass through. Some of the marks were the marks of genuine achievement, of real problems addressed with real competence. Some were the marks of a man who had treated the most powerful office in the democratic world as a tool rather than a trust, and who had found, as people who do this always find, that the tool eventually turns. He did not grieve the loss in any way that was visible to anyone who observed him in its aftermath. What he did was something more characteristic. He assessed it. He looked at what had happened with the same clear and unsentimental attention that he brought to everything else that had ever failed, and he extracted from the assessment the information it contained, and he filed the information away alongside everything else, and he began the next phase. Because there was always a next phase for Lex Luthor, and the next phase was always the thing that the previous phase had been building toward, even when the previous phase had ended in ruins. The ruins were just more material, and he had always been very good at building. The political consultants who worked on his campaign recorded their experience of working for him with a mixture of professional admiration and personal discomfort that his former employees at LexCorp would have recognized. He was extraordinarily well prepared for every meeting and every event. He had read everything relevant to every topic that might arise, had formed views on it, and was able to discuss it with a specificity that made the usual political generalities look like what they were, performances for audiences who did not expect or want the actual complexity. He could go into a room of specialists in any policy domain and discuss their work at a level that they found both surprising and somewhat challenging because the politician who actually understood their field was a novel experience for most of them. What he could not do, and what the consultants could not teach him to do, and eventually stopped trying, was perform the specific kind of warmth that democratic politics requires of its successful practitioners. Not the warmth of actual human connection. The consultants had given up on that early, but the performance of it, the practiced expression of interest in the lives and experiences of ordinary voters that the most successful politicians learn to produce with a convincingness that approaches genuine feeling. Lex could produce a version of this, technically adequate, that passed at the distances that most political interaction happens at. Up close, in the small rooms, with the people who were good at reading what was actually happening behind the performance, it was visibly and irreducibly a performance, and performances of warmth are always less effective than the thing they are imitating. Breathe slowly. There is nothing to hurry toward. The night is long, and the story is not finished, and you have all the time you need to let it move through you at its own pace. The image of Lex Luthor, the bald head, the cold eyes, the still quality of someone who controls even the outward expression of what he is feeling. Let it sit in the middle distance, not demanding anything from you, just present. The interior life of Lex Luthor is the part of the story that the public record is least equipped to address. The record captures behavior, the decisions made, the actions taken, the statements issued, the consequences produced. It is a record of outputs, of the products of a particular kind of mind operating under a particular set of conditions across a particular span of time. What it cannot capture, and what any complete account of the man requires, is the inner life that produced those outputs. What he actually believed, what he actually feared, what he told himself in the moments when there was no audience and no performance required, and the interior was permitted to simply be what it was. He told himself that he was right. This is the first and most consistent thing he told himself, across all the years and all the failures and all the accumulated evidence that the world had repeatedly offered against the proposition. Not right in the trivial sense, not right about specific tactical decisions. He was capable of acknowledging error at the level of specific decisions, and he did so with the straightforwardness of someone for whom error was information rather than shame. Right in the deeper sense, right about the nature of the world, right about how it worked and what it required and what the appropriate response to its requirements was. The belief in his own rightness was the thing that made him what he was, in both the constructive and the destructive senses. It was the engine of the extraordinary achievements, the confidence to attempt what others considered impossible, the refusal to accept limits that others had internalized, the willingness to commit fully and persistently to a course of action, even when the short-term evidence was discouraging. All of these required the bedrock certainty that his assessment of the situation was more accurate than the assessments that the situation was producing in other people, and that bedrock certainty was what the inner life provided. It was also the thing that prevented him from learning what the failures were trying to teach him, because the belief in his own rightness, when it was functioning as a genuine article of faith, rather than as a working hypothesis subject to revision, made the failures mean something different than they meant to everyone else. To everyone else, the pattern of his failures, the regularity with which his most ambitious plans collapsed, often at the moment of greatest apparent proximity to success, looked like a demonstration that something in his fundamental approach was wrong. To him, each failure was a circumstantial problem, a failure of execution, or of information, or of the specific people involved, never a failure of the underlying model. There was a loneliness in all of this that he acknowledged to himself more fully than he acknowledged it to anyone else, which is to say that he acknowledged it somewhat. It was the loneliness of the person who is absolutely certain of something that the people around them cannot fully share, a kind of isolation that has the specific quality of intellectual rather than emotional disconnection, of being separated from others not by feeling but by understanding, by occupying a cognitive position from which the world looks different than it looks from the positions available to other people. He had felt this since childhood. It had been the ambient condition of his interior life for so long that it was indistinguishable from simply being Lex Luthor. Superman represented something in his inner life that was different from what the man represented in his strategic planning, and keeping those two things separate required more effort than he would have acknowledged. In the strategic register, Superman was a problem, a variable that needed to be accounted for and eventually neutralized, a capability in the world that existed outside his sphere of influence, and that the logic of his map required him to bring within it or eliminate. This was the language of the plan, the language he used in his operational thinking, and in the rare conversations he had with people about the subject. In the private register, the register that had no audience and no language because it had never needed one, Superman was something else. He was a mirror of a specific and uncomfortable kind, that reflected back at Lex the thing he most needed to not see. Because what Superman demonstrated by his existence and his choices and the way that every interaction between them unfolded was that it was possible to have extraordinary power and to use it without the corruption that Lex's entire philosophy said was inevitable. That the combination of capability and goodness was not an unstable compound that always eventually separated into one or the other. That a person could be more powerful than any human institution and still choose, consistently and without visible strain, to be accountable to something beyond their own interests. This was intolerable. Not because Lex envied it exactly, though envy was probably present in the mixture. It was intolerable because it disproved a premise that had been load-bearing in his architecture of self-understanding for his entire adult life. The premise was that power and virtue were fundamentally incompatible beyond a certain scale, that the acquisition of significant power required compromises that accumulated into a form of corruption, that the fully virtuous person was always, by definition, a person who had chosen not to acquire too much power because they understood what acquiring it would cost them. This premise had allowed him to make a kind of peace with what he had become. If power always corrupted, then his corruption was not a personal failure but a structural inevitability, the price of operating at the level he operated at. Superman did not pay that price. This was what made him so profoundly threatening, in a way that went beyond strategy, beyond the question of what to do about an extraordinary capability operating outside institutional accountability. He was threatening because his existence was an argument, made in living form, against the premise that had been allowing Lex Luthor to live with himself. And arguments made in living form by people who are not even trying to make arguments are the ones that are most impossible to dismiss and most impossible to fully accept. In the quiet of the spaces between campaigns and schemes and the elaborate machinery of his life, Lex sometimes arrived at something that might, in another person, have been recognized as grief. Not the grief of loss, exactly. He had experienced loss and knew what it felt like, knew the specific weight of it, the way it occupied the same space as the thing that was gone. This was different. It was more like the grief of proximity to something you cannot quite reach, the specific sadness of someone who can see clearly what they might have been and cannot close the distance between that vision and what they are. He did not stay in these moments. He was not built for staying in them, and his habits of mind, which had been built for forward motion and problem-solving and the relentless production of the next strategy from the wreckage of the previous one, did not allow him to inhabit the reflective space long enough for it to actually change anything. He moved through those moments the way water moves through a crack in stone, present briefly, gone before the stone can respond, the passage leaving only the subtlest trace, in time, not even the trace. The relationships he had built across his life were, with very few exceptions, relationships of utility. People he valued for what they contributed to his projects, what they brought to his various enterprises, what position they occupied in the networks that connected him to the things he needed. This was not cruelty. He was not cruel to these people. He treated them with the specific regard of someone who genuinely valued the contribution, even when they were not particularly interested in the contributor as a person with a full interior life of their own. The distinction between valuing someone and caring about them was one that he navigated with the unconscious ease of a person who has never had to examine it. There had been people, across the years, who had tried to reach through the strategic apparatus of his social existence to the person underneath. People who had seen something in him, in the quality of his attention when it was not performing, in the occasional unguarded moments, in the rare instances when the vast machinery of self-management had a gap in it and something less arranged leaked through, and who had decided on the basis of what they saw in those moments that the person underneath was worth the effort of reaching. He had let some of them get partway there. None of them had gotten all the way. This is what he told himself in the dark, in the most honest formulation he could manage in the spaces where honesty was the only available currency, that the thing he had built, the empire and the philosophy and the elaborately defended inner keep of his identity, had been built to protect something, not to be something, to protect it. And that the protection had been so thorough, so complete, so well maintained across so many decades, that the thing being protected had become, over time, very difficult to locate, not gone. He did not tell himself it was gone, but far inside, behind all the architecture of defence, in a place that the ordinary traffic of his life no longer reached. Let that image rest with you, not as a judgment. Judgments do not belong in this hour. Just as a picture, a man alone in the dark, in the interior of the self that no audience has access to, sitting with the distance between what he is and what he might have been, in the specific way that people with very sharp minds sit with very difficult truths, completely, without flinching, and completely alone. We move forward now. There is more of the story to go. Let the breath carry you. The nights were the most honest part of his life, and he knew this in the way that we all know the truest things about ourselves, not through deliberate examination, but through the recurring return to the same territory, the same thoughts arriving in the same sequence, the same conclusions settling into the same positions with the reliability of furniture that has been placed and never moved. In the nights, the performance was off. There was no audience, no interlocutor, no strategic objective that required the management of how he appeared. There was only the interior, in whatever condition the day had left it, and the interior was something he had never entirely made peace with. He read in the nights as he had always read, not for the specific information, as he might have read during the day, but for the particular quality of company that books provide at 2 a.m, the sense of a mind speaking directly into yours without the mediation of social performance, without the usual tax that human interaction levies on him. He had found in literature what he had not reliably found in people, a form of genuine contact that did not require him to manage the impression he was making, that gave what it had to give without conditions. The irony of a man who approached all human relationships strategically finding his most reliable connection in the non-strategic medium of art was not lost on him, though he permitted himself to consider it only glancingly before moving on to the next page. The breath is very slow now, almost imperceptibly slow, the kind of breathing that belongs to the threshold between waking and sleep, where the body has already arrived at rest and the mind is following at its own unhurried pace. Let this segment come to you in that way, not grasped at but received, the way sounds arrive in a quiet room without being summoned. The warsuit was the most personal thing he ever made. This requires some qualification, because Lex Luthor made many things across the span of his life, and the question of which of them was most personal admits of multiple defensible answers. He made LexCorp, which was in many ways an externalization of his worldview, a physical and institutional embodiment of his philosophy about how resources and intelligence and will could be organized to produce power. He made the kryptonite containment system, which was the product of some of his most focused and motivated research. He made policies and strategies and political positions and legal arguments, all of which carried his character in ways that were traceable by those who knew how to read them. The warsuit was different from all of these. It was different because it was for him. Not for LexCorp, not for the project, not as an instrument to be deployed in service of a larger plan. For him, for his body, to be worn by him specifically. A powered armor that placed the technological capability he had spent his life building in direct contact with the physical person of Lex Luthor, so that what he was, and what he could do, were no longer separated by the distance between himself and his resources, but fused, integrated, the person and the capability occupying the same space at the same moment. The engineering of it was extraordinary by any standard. He directed its development with the hands-on engagement he brought to the things that mattered most to him, working through the technical problems personally, rather than delegating them, spending hours in the design environment that his research facility provided with the focused absorption of someone who is doing the thing they were made to do. The power systems, the defensive capabilities, the weapon systems, each of these was approached as its own engineering challenge, solved with elegance rather than mere adequacy, built to a standard that reflected the builder's belief that anything worth building was worth building at the level of the best possible version of itself. Sit with what the warsuit meant for a moment. A man who had built his entire life on the superiority of his mind, on the premise that intelligence properly deployed was the most powerful thing available to a human being, building a suit that supplemented the intelligence with physical capability that put him in the same register as the one adversary that his intelligence alone had never been sufficient to address. There is something in this that is not merely tactical. There is something that says, I have tried the way I know how to try, and it has not been enough, and I am going to change what I bring to the problem until it is. The first time he wore the suit in a genuine engagement rather than a test, the experience was unlike anything his previous life had provided. He had been powerful in all the ways that power can exist at a remove from the body, through money, through authority, through the deference of people who understood that his displeasure had consequences. But this was different. This was the power that the body feels when it is operating at the limit of its enhanced capability, when the suit's systems are engaged, and the augmented strength and the energy weapons and the defensive fields are all active, and the person inside is no longer subject to the ordinary physical limitations that constrain human action. It was, he acknowledged to himself, extraordinary. It was also, he acknowledged to himself with the same honesty, insufficient, because the person he'd built it to engage remained, in the suit as out of it, beyond the reach of what he could produce. The warsuit put him in a different category than an unaugmented human. It did not put him in Superman's category. The gap between what the suit could do and what Superman could do was narrower than it had been without the suit, but it was still a gap, still a distance that the engineering had not closed and that, given the underlying physics of the situation, could probably not be closed by engineering alone. The suit was the most powerful thing he had ever personally embodied. It was still not enough. And yet he wore it, repeatedly and across many engagements over the years, not because he had concluded it was sufficient, but because the alternative to insufficient action was no action, and no action was not something his character permitted. He fought in the suit with the full commitment that characterized everything he did. Not recklessly, not without calculation, but with the absolute investment of someone who has decided that this is the field of engagement, and that the appropriate response to being on the field is to compete with everything you have, regardless of whether what you have is equal to what you're competing against. The question that the warsuit raised, and that he was never fully able to put down, was the question of what he was actually trying to accomplish. Not tactically. Tactically, the objectives were usually clear enough, specific enough to be planned toward and executed against. The deeper question, the one that lived below the tactical layer and that the tactical layer was, in some sense, always a way of not having to address directly. He had spent enormous resources and enormous ingenuity on the problem of Superman across the span of their relationship. He had made the kryptonite, built the suit, developed contingency plans of extraordinary complexity for scenarios in which he was able to neutralize Superman's capabilities or, in some versions of the planning, permanently eliminate them. What came after that, in the plans, was always somewhat vague. The world without Superman as an active limiting factor, the world where the extraordinary capability had been removed or constrained to his satisfaction, what happened in that world was never as fully specified as what happened before it. He had plans for the removal, and much less developed plans for the aftermath, which is perhaps the most revealing thing about the nature of the project. It was not really about the aftermath. It was about the conflict itself, about the engagement with the one thing in the world that his usual methods had proven insufficient to handle, the one variable that remained stubbornly and infuriatingly outside his sphere of control. Superman, he understood in his most honest moments, had become the organizing principle of his life in a way that he would not have chosen and could not fully undo. Not the Empire. The Empire predated Superman and would have continued as the organizing principle if Superman had never arrived. But the Empire's direction, the use to which its resources were put, the definition of what constituted success and failure in the operation of all of Lex's considerable capabilities, all of these had been reoriented, in ways both deliberate and involuntary, by the presence of the man in the sky. He had defined himself against Superman the way that people define themselves against the things they cannot accept, and the definition had become so deeply embedded in his identity that he could no longer clearly see where it stopped and where the rest of him began. This is the specific form that obsession takes when it occurs in very organized minds. It does not look like disorder. It looks like mission. It presents itself as a rational project with legitimate justifications, and in Lex's case, the justifications were not entirely without merit, which made the obsession harder to identify as such. He could make the argument for why Superman's unchecked presence was a genuine problem for human civilization, and he could make it well, and portions of the argument were genuinely persuasive to people who encountered them in good faith. But the argument and the obsession were not the same thing, and the argument, even when it was valid, was always in service of the obsession rather than the other way around. He had, across the years, genuinely respected Superman. This is not a comfortable thing to include in this account, because the relationship was so defined by conflict that the presence of respect within it feels like a violation of the narrative logic. But it was real. He respected the consistency, the commitment, the fact that the enormous capability was deployed with a discipline and a moral seriousness that he recognized, even in opposition to it, as genuine rather than performed. He respected the intelligence, which was different from his own but not inferior to it, a different kind of extraordinary mind, oriented toward different things, producing different outputs. He respected the fact that Superman had never, across their entire history, been cruel, had never used the enormous advantage he held to simply end the conflict when ending it, would have been entirely within his power. What he felt about that, the fact that he could have been ended, and had not been, across all the years of their conflict, was something he examined rarely and carefully, the way you examine a thing that has the potential to change what you believe if you look at it too directly. It said something about Superman that was undeniable. It also said something about Lex Luthor that he found more difficult to sit with, that he had been given, repeatedly and over decades, a form of mercy that he had not extended to others in comparable situations, and that the mercy had been given not as a weakness, but as a choice, made by someone who understood what he was choosing and chose it anyway. The warsuit, hanging in its case in the facility where he kept it, was the most concentrated expression of what he had spent his life doing, the most personal distillation of the project that his life had become. He looked at it sometimes with something that was not quite pride and not quite grief, and not quite the determined forward-looking assessment that he usually brought to his significant possessions, with something that was perhaps closer to recognition. "This is who I am," the suit seemed to say, in the particular language of objects that have absorbed the energy of the people who made them. "This is what I chose to become," and the looking in those moments was very still and very honest, and did not reach for any conclusion that the looking itself had not earned. The decision to build the warsuit was not made at a single moment. It accreted. The way that significant decisions accrete in the lives of people who are systematic thinkers, not a sudden resolution but a slow convergence, a gradual narrowing of the available alternatives until the one that remained was the one that the logic of the situation had been pointing toward all along. He had been moving toward the warsuit for years before he acknowledged it consciously, which is the way that the most important decisions tend to work in the interior of a very organized mind. The decision is made below the level of articulation, and then revealed to the conscious mind as though it had arrived from outside, though it had been building from within all along. The engineers who were brought into the warsuit project were among the most exceptional people LexCorp employed, which was a high standard given the company's resources and reputation for attracting talent. They came in with the understanding that the project was classified beyond any other they had worked on, that its existence was not to be discussed, and its details were not to be shared, and that the work they would be doing was both the most technically challenging and the most personally consequential of their careers. Most of them found this to be accurate. The engineering problems were genuinely hard in ways that required solutions that had not previously existed, and the requirement that they produce those solutions on Lex's schedule pushed them to the kind of work that people who do technical work remember as the defining experience of their professional lives. We have arrived at the last part of the story. Let that land gently, not as an ending, because the story of a life does not end cleanly, but as the place where we will rest tonight, the furthest point on this particular journey, before the journey gives way to sleep. Your breath is very slow. The room is very still. Let the last segment come in quietly. The question that the story of Lex Luthor finally poses, not as a moral lesson, not as a cautionary tale with a tidy application, but as a genuine and unresolved question about the nature of human intelligence and human will, is this: what does brilliance become when it chooses itself? Not when it's turned outward, toward the problems that the world presents, toward the suffering that surrounds it, toward the genuine and complex difficulties of existence that wait for minds capable of engaging them seriously, but when it turns inward, when it orients its full and extraordinary capacity toward the maintenance and elaboration and defense of the self that contains it. Lex Luthor was as intelligent as any human being who has ever lived. This is not hyperbole. The record of what his mind produced across the span of his life, the technical achievements, the strategic constructions, the political maneuvering, the quality of the arguments he made and the precision with which he understood the positions he opposed, constitutes evidence for a cognitive capability that occupies the genuinely upper region of what the species has produced. The question was never the capacity, the question was always the direction. In his later years, the direction was consistent. The intelligence had found its permanent orientation toward the project of Lex Luthor, toward the maintenance of his position and the advancement of his agenda and the elaboration of his conflict with the one adversary that the agenda could not neutralize. He was brilliant at this, as he was brilliant at everything he applied himself to. The schemes grew more sophisticated with time rather than less, the planning more thorough, the contingency mapping more complete. He was better at being Lex Luthor at 60 than he had been at 40, which is a strange thing to say and also, on examination, clearly true. What he was not better at was the thing that might have made the rest of it mean something. The connection to other people that had always eluded him had not grown easier with age and the accumulation of experience. If anything, it had grown slightly harder, as the habits of a lifetime settled deeper into the structure of how he operated, and the gaps in the architecture that might have admitted other people became progressively less accessible. Not through deliberate closure, simply through the gradual calcification that happens when a structure is loaded consistently in the same direction for long enough that the loading becomes the structure. He was alone in the specific way that very powerful people are alone, surrounded by people whose professional existence required their proximity to him, whose actual lives were organized around the fact of his presence and his needs, but none of whom were present in the way that a person is present when they are there for you rather than for what you require. He had chosen this, or something close enough to chosen that the distinction between choice and consequence had collapsed into the same thing. The aloneness was the product of the same mind and the same map that had produced the Empire, and the kryptonite and the warsuit and the presidency. All of the achievements and the aloneness arrived from the same source, took shape through the same decisions, and were in that sense inseparable. There are accounts of moments scattered across the later period of his life when something different briefly appeared, when the control and the strategic orientation and the elaborately maintained self-possession gave way, briefly, to something raw and less managed. A moment of genuine humour, of the kind that is unperformed and therefore reveals rather than conceals. A response to something beautiful, music sometimes, which bypassed the analytical apparatus more readily than most things could, arriving at something in him that the apparatus was not positioned to intercept. A conversation, occasionally, in which the interlocutor had succeeded in reaching past the performance to the person, and had said something that landed in a place where real things lived. In those moments, he was recognizable as someone who might have been different. Someone who, if the boy in the Smallville fields had made different use of the open moment, might have built something other than what he built, and become something other than what he became. The moments were brief. They were real. They are perhaps the most important part of the story, not because they changed anything, but because they demonstrate that what was lost was genuinely there to be lost, that the alternatives were not hypothetical but actual, present in him as potential that was never fully activated, never given the conditions it needed to become the dominant pattern rather than the occasional interruption. The legacy of Lex Luthor is, like all real legacies, more complicated than any single characterization can hold. He built things that still stand. Technologies that his research produced still function in devices and systems that benefit people who have no knowledge of where they came from. The organizational methods he developed at LexCorp became templates that other enterprises adapted and used. The problems he identified, the accountability questions he raised about extraordinary power operating outside institutional constraint, remained real questions even when his motivations for raising them were mixed. Legacies do not require clean hearts to produce real contributions, and the contributions were real. He also caused real harm. This is equally true and equally required for honest account. The harm was not always dramatic, not always the spectacular failure of the grand scheme, the kind of harm that makes newspapers and histories. Much of it was quieter. The opportunities foregone, the trust broken, the people who came into his orbit expecting one thing and received something that served his purposes rather than their needs. The harm accumulated across a lifetime the way that certain kinds of weather accumulate, without event through the steady persistence of conditions that were not what was needed. Superman outlasted him. This is perhaps the simplest summary of the relationship's ultimate shape. Not that Superman won and Lex lost, because the relationship was never simple enough for that framing, but that the man in the sky, who had arrived without warning and changed everything, was still there when the force that had organized itself so completely against him had finally exhausted what it had to bring to the engagement. Still present, still choosing the same things he'd always chosen, still extending the same consistent mercy to the adversary who had never quite been able to accept it. Still, in the end, what he had always been. And Lex Luthor was what he had always been too. This is the thing that is hardest to sit with in the story of a very intelligent person who was also very wrong about some important things. The consistency of it. He did not become a different person in the later chapters. He became a more fully realized version of the same person, which is the direction that all of us move in as we age, regardless of whether the direction is the right one. The boy in the Smallville fields and the man in the warsuit and the president in the Oval Office and the prisoner in whichever facility was currently holding him, all of these were the same person, at different stages of the same project, expressing the same essential orientation toward the world with the increasing clarity that comes with practice. The world he left was not the world he intended to leave. This is true of almost everyone, but it is particularly true of people with ambitions of his scale, because the gap between the intended and the actual grows proportionally with the ambition. He had intended to leave a world shaped in his image, a world organized according to his understanding of how things worked and what they required. What he left instead was what all of us leave, the traces of a passage through a place that did not fundamentally change for having contained him, that was affected by his presence, and that continued after it. The traces are real. They are in the institutions that still carry the imprint of his methods. They are in the technologies that his research produced. They are in the specific questions about power and accountability, and the relationship between extraordinary capability and democratic governance that he raised, imperfectly and for complicated reasons, but raised nonetheless and that remained genuinely open. They are in the story itself, which is a trace of a kind, the account of a life preserved in the amber of narrative, kept available for whoever comes to it and finds in it what they need to find. Rest now. The story is complete, or as complete as the story of any life can be, which is to say that it has arrived at a resting place rather than an ending, because lives do not end so much as they cease. Let the image of Lex Luthor go, the empire and the kryptonite and the warsuit and the presidency and the boy in the field and the man at the window. Let all of it settle into the soft dark of the night, where everything is equal, where nothing presses harder than anything else, where the extraordinary and the ordinary lie down together and become simply what was. You have travelled a long way tonight, through the rooms of a remarkable and troubled life, through the architecture of an intelligence that built so much and held so tightly to the wrong things, through the history of a man who was capable of anything and chose some things over others, with all the consequence that choosing always carries. Let it be enough. Let the breathing carry you now, down into the slow country of sleep, where the stories dissolve and the questions rest, and the weight of everything you've carried today becomes for a little while nothing at all. If this story found you where you needed to be found tonight, leave a comment below telling me where in the world you're watching from and what the hour is, and if there is a life, a legend, a history you'd like to fall asleep inside next, let me know. The next story is already waiting. Sleep well. Sleep. The question of what it means to choose yourself, to orient the whole of a remarkable capacity toward the maintenance and elaboration of your own position in the world, rather than toward the world itself, is not a question that admits of a simple moral judgment. Simple moral judgments require simple objects, and Lex Luthor was not a simple object. He was a person of extraordinary capability who had grown up in conditions that made self-protection feel essential rather than optional, who had been taught by the first and most important person in his life that the self was what you built and defended, who had arrived at adulthood with a map that said self was the primary project and the world was the territory that the self moved through. He followed the map was wrong. These things are not contradictions. There are people who encounter the story of Lex Luthor and find in it primarily a story about intelligence gone wrong, about the specific dangers of brilliance unmoored from compassion, This reading is not inaccurate, but it is incomplete. The more interesting reading, the one that requires something from the reader, is the one that finds in Lex Luthor a story about the cost of the specific things that his culture most rewards: the relentless self-sufficiency, the refusal to need, the performance of total capability that allows no visible crack in the armor for anything as vulnerable as genuine connection. These are not the failure modes of a villain. They are the default settings of a certain kind of success, and Lex Luthor was nothing if not successful, until he was nothing if not alone. The city of Metropolis stands as it always has, its towers catching the morning light and throwing it back in all directions, its streets moving with the particular energy of a place that has not finished becoming what it will eventually be. Somewhere in the structure of the city, in its research institutions, in its legal frameworks, in the patterns of its power and its charity and its corruption, the traces of Lex Luthor remain, as the traces of anyone who has passed through a place with sufficient force remain, shaping what comes after in ways that are real even when they are invisible. The city absorbed him, and was changed by the absorption, and continues, as cities continue, without him.